about human cloning, where it started, where it's going, how's it affecting our lives now and in the future. Um, Julian, do you want to give us a little background about human cloning?
Yeah, so I have like a formal definition of cloning, and it's the process of taking genetic information from one living thing and creating identical copies of it. And so there's like three different types. There's gene cloning, therapeutic cloning, and reproductive cloning. Gene cloning is taking segments of DNA in organisms and copying them. This can pinpoint sections of traits that want to be replicated. This method is used in genetically modified organisms. Therapeutic cloning produces embryonic stem cells used for the research of disease and treatments. The hope for this method is to eventually be able to grow new body parts like skin and even heart so that the body doesn't reject it. Um, Finally, reproductive cloning is making a copy of an entire organism. Reproductive cloning happens when a skin cell from the original organism is implanted into an unfertilized egg with the DNA removed. This makes sure that only the DNA from the original organism can be copied in the cell making the clone. So some cons, I guess, to human cloning is that it could potentially cause defects and it limits diversity. But some pros, it can help with disease, getting rid of illnesses, and it could make humans potentially live longer.
So let me hop in there real quick. So essentially, what you're saying was the whole concept of human cloning was to both extend the life of a human or just the general society, or to improve upon human society before and after birth, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
If I can add on to that, specifically talking about how human life would be longer, as far as the social aspect comes, this would cause a lot of issues as far as overpopulation, because as you get these lifespans longer, you start to lose resources because, even though they're old, people still need the resources. They still need food. They still need water. They still need a place to live. And then it becomes into a utopian dystopia, really. And there's clearly obvious, statements of that in pop culture, especially you look at A Brave New World, which is one of the most popular sci-fi books out there, how the cloning really can change and really affect how a culture believes, how they think, because eventually you get pretty much human robots because you only have the best genes selected. So everybody's the same. There's no, freedom if you look at it like that. And especially looking at human cloning going forward, some of the backlash does come from the church itself because they look at the people who are trying to clone others as people who are trying to play God. And by changing, their hair color, their eyes, everything about them that can really be altered. So that way they're healthier, they're stronger, they're faster, you name it, and that's what you get. And you lose out on the people who would be something really special in a different field because of this cloning. Especially genetic engineering specifically, separate from the whole idea of making a brand new human. Changing the genes before a baby is born is seen in the movie Gattaca, another, sci-fi movie where the main character is the son born before the genetic engineering was made possible, and the other was born after. And from a freak accident, the kid who was looked at as the hero, the good kid, he had the perfect genes, he died. And all of a sudden, this kid who was not perfect, who was never viewed as anything, was forced to kind of rewrite his own destiny. And it's a tough situation once again because there's a balance. If you can save a kid's life from having cancer at 15, who's not going to want to do that? We're humans. We're made to have that empathetic viewpoint on other humans. So it becomes a balance of how much can you really push. And once again, my personal opinion is that there has to be rules, there has to be legislation on this, because if there's not, who's to stop other scientists from pushing it too far? And even looking at really awful scenarios, you look at what the Nazis did in Germany during the Second World War, and they really did some awful things to twins to see if it worked. While their answers didn't prove positive, who's to stop that from happening again in a different scenario with cloning with newer technology? It's a slippery slope when you look at it.
That's interesting. Okay, Tyler. So piggyback off of what you said before, imagine if you were able to have access to human cloning. and you were able to human clone your kids, right? And what I mean by that is you're able to change your kid's attributes on the gene level so that you choose your kid to be either fat, skinny, short, tall, like the facial structures, if you want them to have different colored eyes, like blue, potentially even red eyes. And those are physical, but I believe you can also change internal factors as well, like their personality, and stuff like more of a nurtured, more of a nature type of upbringing, if they're good or evil, and stuff like that. So, Jillian, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure. So actually what you said about like personality is really interesting because if you were to have like a set of twins that are identical, their personalities are going to actually be different throughout their lifetime because they come across like different experiences. They have, even if they have a similar childhood, they're still going to be different in that sense. But for the child, like you said, pinpointing what traits you want them to have through genetic engineering, I just think it's really unnatural because when we're doing that, we're taking away like the natural part of reproduction. So that's kind of taking away like Darwin's theory of natural selection when we're like pinpointing what traits we want and we're trying to make like a superior human by producing humans how we want or like without flaws. I just think it's really unnatural and I think that needs to happen naturally.
And going off of that, I could totally imagine that if you had a superior type of human, uh, this type of technology would only be available to the uber wealthy and separating the gap between wealthy and poor. Um, and I believe this, now at least for the most part, like what you just said would make everything like I'm blanking. I am blanking.
Well, it's no different if you think about it. It's no different than what's going on now with Corona. We have people who are really sick and they're dying because they don't have the proper insurance. They can't afford the hospital stay. So, regardless of any health procedure that we have done, it's always going to be leaning towards the wealthy just because they're going to be more able to afford it. They're going to be more able to put that money forward to get that extra help. So, I mean, socially, this one specifically should end up dividing the classes more, which will be an issue because if you can make a superior race almost by having the best genes pulled together, it's just going to further separate the uppers from the lowers, and the working class, the lower class are really going to be looked down upon as not even equal because of the fact that they don't have the gene pool that the rich and powerful have.
Interesting. And just, or by any chance, you guys familiar with a few years back, there was a Chinese scientist who actually altered the DNA of two twin girls before birth. And as a result, this Chinese scientist was completely shunned by the scientific community. What do you guys think about that?
Personally, I think that's a good thing. Every movement has to start somewhere, and I think this will at least serve as a warning to show the dangers of cloning, but also the potential. And you need someone like that willing to take that risk. While it didn't work out for him, I'm sure scientists learned from his mistakes, from what he did right, what he did wrong. So for each mistake that's made along the way, while it is awful what happened to the young girls, it will help the scientific community going forward.
No, I completely agree. Also, some interesting motivations. Like for me, I believe one of his motivations, of course, any type of progression, any new technology, is to get as much money as possible in a short amount of time, right? That's the reason why. Unless another possible motivation, his part could be actually trying to progress science. But for the most part, he has to be backed by someone who wants to collect as much money in the shortest amount of time possible, as I said earlier. And it's really interesting because this is what happens in most tech. They get backed and they have a ton of seed money by a venture capitalist, and it's fairly interesting because I feel like human cloning and genetic modification is one of those weird exceptions where reality stopped its progression. So essentially, as soon as this Chinese scientist was shunned by the scientific community, everyone was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Okay, this is going way too far." And as a result, now human cloning is looked down on a negative light, and it's fairly interesting because again, I feel like human cloning was one of those weird exceptions. and it's also human genetic modification was considered morally good in countries like Japan, China, and the United States, and before they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into solving world's problems like hunger by genetically modifying foods. So it's only this one specific aspect of genetic modification, which is human cloning, that now the entirety of genetic modification is now looking at. Everyone's looking at genetic modification in a completely different light. Hey, what are the future effects of genetic modification that we have not seen prior? And I feel like human cloning actually, although this was a terrible thing the Chinese scientists did, and no one should condone what he did, it did slow down basically the progression of genetic modification, and people are like, okay, let's put a lot more research to actually see the effects. And once we do that, then we can start putting a little more money into genetic modification in order to solve, again, the world's biggest problems like hunger, and again, hopefully human cloning in the future. Okay, guys. So in this podcast, we talked about genetic and modifications. More specifically, we talked about human cloning as well. However, in the beginning of the podcast, we posed a question to the viewers at home and you guys, which was, do you want to be cloned? If so, why? And now I'm going to ask you, has this podcast changed your mind? And if so, why?
For me, I would like to see another copy of myself, like made at a different age, growing up with different experiences, to see how I would turn out. Like, I'll develop a different personality, have different experiences, have different I might look a little different just from environmental effects of me. I want to see, I just want to see how I would turn out, but I don't think it's right to copy someone genetically, because it takes away diversity, and it might cause like defects along the line, and it's just not natural.
So because this podcast made you more neutral, because I remember in the beginning of the podcast you were more extreme. So yeah, at least this podcast changed your mind a little bit. So Tyler, how about you? What do you think?
I would still like to, maybe not myself, but I'd like the progression of human cloning pushed a little bit more. I think it's very beneficial, especially when it comes down to the genetics and making sure people are healthier. I think there just has to be a plan for it. That way we don't end up going too far too quickly and going into some really bad situations.
Okay, guys. So in that case, thank you for showing up.